With this here, this ain't about being flashy. This is game day, son. It's only about one thing. Getting that W. That's the only thing that matters right now. Boy, are you ready?
The past is the past, you know? It's a new day, bro. My day. You gotta do it now.
All right, guys, Blindside Fantasy Football Podcast back to recap the Week 15. Matt couldn't be here tonight. He's kind of mourning the loss of his fantasy team thanks to a lot of dud performances. He had a really, really stacked team and just got a lot of bad things. LaShawn McCoy, No Sean Moreno, Calvin Johnson, Alfred Morris, Demaryius Thomas. You know, when those five guys combine for no touchdowns, it's a bad week, especially when you own all of them. So we got Rob on today. Maybe Rob will be able to give us some insight into some of his rankings last weekend. How's it going, Rob?
Well, I'm a little in mourning too. I fell into that playoff victim of Jamal Charles, as I'm sure many of you out there might have. So, if you have him, great. If you don't, and you were playing him, I feel your pain.
There's a lot of people that playing against Jamal Charles this weekend. If you play against him, there's almost a sure loss for you. I mean, I can't imagine many people played Jamal Charles and still lost. I mean, for teams that did, I guess you got to feel for them even more. Can you imagine that? I mean, starting a guy, getting that kind of production and still losing. Wow. But what a crazy week this week, Rob. I mean, obviously, well, maybe with your bold predictions you had all of your rankings, but pretty much everything you predicted actually happened, right? I mean, It's a crazy weekend. And then the things you expected went even crazier, like we just said, Jamal Charles, just crazy stuff. So let's get into this. Let's recap the Week 15 games this week. As we met, Thursday, no Thursday night game this week, so nothing to preview on Thursday. So might end up being a pretty quick podcast today. But Redskins and Falcons, obviously this was a really easy matchup for Kirk Cousins, and he looked pretty good in this game. 381 yards, 3 touchdowns, did have a couple of picks. Pierre Garçon appeared to benefit the most with 129 yards and a touchdown on 7 catches. It's his first game with either 100 yards or a touchdown in over a month. Rob, do you think we're going to continue to see this type of connection between Garçon and Cousins?
I do, and I think it's a lot of it's got to do with just the volume. There's lack of Alfred Morris is sort of slowing down. There's lack of talent around him. If Jordan Reed doesn't come back this season, which is a high possibility, then Garçon is really the guy in the passing game that should see obviously a majority of the targets. But I was impressed with Cousins. If you're still in the playoffs and you're looking at your matchups next week, he's got Dallas, which I think is an incredible matchup for him and Garçon. I predict another big day out of Garçon and out of Cousins next week.
Yeah, I was gonna say if you're in your fantasy championship, hopefully you've got your quarterback position kind of locked down. But to Rob's point, I know myself in a lot of those daily fantasy leagues, the FanDuels, the Draft Streets, Kirk Cousins definitely a guy you can get on the cheap that should still have pretty similar production this week against a really bad Cowboys secondary. Rob, you kind of mentioned Alfred Morris a little bit. I don't want to say it was a bad day, but you were still kind of expecting more out of this matchup. Had the 98 rushing yards, but, still had that fumble, which kind of killed his fantasy value. No touchdowns, obviously. Just a, tough day for Alfred Morris owners. Meanwhile, Falcons offense, continues to just kind of sputter along. Would you feel confident starting any of the Falcons players against a tough 49ers defense this upcoming weekend?
I wouldn't say confident. I also, I wouldn't say that I necessarily wouldn't start any of them. It depends, obviously, on your lineup and who you've been relying on. If you've been relying on many of them, you're most likely not making it to this point in the playoffs. But that is a tough matchup. But at the same time, Atlanta, I feel like they've hit the worst. The worst is over, and now they're starting to gel a little bit as a team, as much as that talent can. So I wouldn't feel confident starting any of them. But with that said, that doesn't necessarily mean I wouldn't start a Steven Jackson or someone else if that's all that I have.
Right, of course, yeah. I mean, the Matt Ryans, the Roddy Whites, if you own those types of guys, you're still playing them. To my point, you put those guys in your lineup, but you just don't feel good about them. Even Steven Jackson, the 2 touchdowns, but really didn't have much going on besides that. You don't feel confident starting those guys, but they're still going to be in your lineups come your championship weekend if you're still in it. But tough matchup against the 49ers this weekend. Bears and Browns, I think we both expected a lot more out of, 2 of the youngest and brightest wide receivers in this game, Alshon Jeffrey and Josh Gordon. I know it's hard to say that they had bad games because they both still had a touchdown. They both had over 65 receiving yards, but I mean, it kind of still was, disappointing out of those 2. I mean, I guess if this is their down game, you're taking it because you're still getting double-digit fantasy points out of them, but just a little disappointing from what a lot of people expected in their fantasy leagues. I know I, for one, own both of them in several leagues, so I was still able to squeak on by, but just expected a little more out of them. Rob, did you have anything you wanted to add about Alshon or Gordon?
On that, like you mentioned, the touchdown sort of saved the day. I feel like this was more of a regression to the mean type game. It's below where they're going to be, but I also think that they've both been playing above what their average production should be. So this might be just that one-game funk. If you do have them rolling into next week, I don't have the matchups right offhand, but I would feel confident that the better days are ahead.
I believe they get Philadelphia this upcoming week. Chicago gets Philadelphia. Cleveland, I don't remember off the top of my head, but Chicago getting Philadelphia, so you like that matchup. Biggest surprise for me in this game was who got the work at tailback for the Browns. Obviously, I was really big on Chris Ogbonnaya going into this game. Had him 18th in my running back rankings this week, but Edwin Baker gets the most carries here, albeit just 8. But you didn't expect Edwin Baker to be the name over Chris Ogbonnaya and Fozzie Whitaker, who finished with just 6 combined carries. Again, let's be honest. You're going into your fantasy championship week. You're not considering any Browns player except for Josh Gordon. Do you agree with that, Rob?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I would have said maybe before this week taking a flyer on Cameron, but with another dud game, you can't trust that.
Yeah, it's just getting really, really tough for that Browns team. Texans and Colts, Sunday marked the first time in over a year that Trent Richardson cracked 60 rushing yards. So he went over 60 rushing yards. To give you an idea on how bad that is, Jamal Charles has cracked 60 rushing yards 12 times this year. Even Doug Martin, who hasn't played since October, has 4 games this year over 60 rushing yards. I mean, I just hate Trent Richardson, and I love proving how bad Trent Richardson is.
It's too bad. It's too bad Matt's not here to go. See, I told you.
It would have been his only time to 60 yards rushing. It's unreal.
Yeah.
I'm not going to waste any more time on Trent Richardson. You know how bad I think he is. You're not starting him next week, even if Donald Brown is out. This is not a guy that you can trust. On Friday, I mentioned you really couldn't trust any of the Colts players. For the fools that went and plugged and played the guy like Derek Rogers, how did that 2 points taste? I mean, I just, like I said, this was another team you just didn't feel confident sticking anybody in. And it just kind of proved the point even more. I'm going to say the same thing going forward. It's really hard to trust any of these guys, except for maybe T.Y. Hilton, those 8 catches. So he is getting a lot of the work. Maybe you trust him, but if you have better options, you should really look towards them. Texans, equally as bad. The one saving grace for the Texans you thought would have been Andre Johnson, but 4 catches, 18 yards on 10 targets. What the fuck, Andre Johnson? I mean, that's just, there's so many fantasy owners that you just killed with that performance. Next week they get the Broncos, so I got to say I'll probably still have him as a top 10 guy because I think he bounces back, but what a terrible performance here. Rob, do you think he bounces back against the Broncos?
I think there's nowhere to go but up after this one, but, Keenum had one of his worst games, and, I think we're going to see a direct correlation between his success, Keenum's success, and Johnson's success. I mean, that connection is really what drives both those guys. So I guess we'll see. I mean, they're definitely passing the ball coming from behind. The Texans are not the team they used to be. So I think he bounces back better than 4 for 18. And if he can get a touchdown or two, he looks really good next week. So I guess we'll see.
Are you going to have him in your top 10?
That sounds just about right. I might have him. I might be overreacting a little bit to this week, but I did watch a good part of this game, and Keenum, my lack of faith in Keenum might actually bump him outside my top 10.
Wow. All right. Patriots and Dolphins. Rob, I don't know if you heard the stat that I threw out on Friday's podcast, and I tweeted it out a couple of times, both on Friday and then again on Sunday morning. But, I kind of give me some credit here for the Edelman call. I said on Friday, when Julian Edelman's playing and Aaron Dobson is out, in those 4 games this year, Edelman had 31 catches for 345 yards, or 354 yards, and 5 touchdowns in those 4 games. We found out Sunday morning that Dobson wasn't going to be playing, so I tweeted out that stat again. And then what did he do? 13 catches, 139 yards, and a touchdown on 19 targets. He has been rock solid, these last few weeks, last month really. Back-to-back weeks with touchdowns. The 2 games prior to those, over 100 yards. He is a very, very solid wide receiver too now.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And one thing that I'm liking that I'm seeing is he's catching the ball more places on the field. He's running more routes. He's not just that slot receiver over the middle now. He's running the screens. He's running the outs. I like seeing different routes being run from him and him being used in a ton of ways. And Brady's on the up, and I think that's causing Edelman to rise as well.
And he's by far, now that Gronk is out, Brady's most trusted receiver too. We expected a little bit more out of Vereen, but Vereen not really getting the work here in this game. Ridley too. Ridley not getting a lot of work in this game. Ridley just 34 total yards. Vereen, like I just mentioned, 21 total yards. You still can't trust any of these Patriots running backs, can you?
No, and it looks like the Dolphins. The Dolphins are a strong defense. It looks like it was their mission to stop these guys, and they accomplished that. But I think teams can't scheme too much for the running backs, especially with a quarterback like Brady. So, after this game, I don't think that teams will, even though the Dolphins came out on top, I don't think that teams will be able to remove Vereen and Ridley in that backfield as much as they did in this game moving forward. But I like the passing game. You're right. I'm a little wary on the running game, though.
Dolphins side, though, Mike Wallace, double-digit fantasy points here and a touchdown. Has had that in 3 out of the last 4 weeks now. How high do you think you'll rank him this week against the Bills, who are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers this year?
I'm probably gonna have him probably 5 or probably 10 spots higher than I usually do. No, not overall. But
I was going to say overall. You said 5, and I'm like, oh my God, overall? Jeez.
No. I'll probably put him around somewhere between 20 and 25, I think. I think he's a solid wideout, too, at this point. And this is the Wallace that I thought we were going to get at the beginning of the year that is sort of just coming around now. But where would you have him?
He's easily cracking my top 20, may push 15, somewhere in there. Just very, very solid these last 4 weeks. He definitely has built up that connection with Tannehill. It seems to be there now. Eagles and Vikings. I want to start off by saying I'm sorry about this game and everything I said about Riley Cooper. I obviously burned, I think, a lot of people this weekend with my Riley Cooper call. As you remember, I had him as my wide receiver 11 this week, and told a lot of people to start him over a lot of other people, and I probably endorsed him more than anybody, and he was just a bust. So I am just really sorry, guys. I expected a lot more. All the signs are there. He's getting the targets. In the beginning, he had that connection with Foles. It was a great matchup. But for one reason or another, I didn't get to see this game, but it sounds like Deshaun Jackson must have just been the guy that was open every time. Or maybe, Deshaun was open every time, so that first look, he just kept feeding the ball and didn't get to that second read because Deshaun was open so much. But Cooper's still been getting the targets. I still really like him. I still think he's got another couple, at least one more big game left before the end of the season. It's just so hard to predict now and so hard to trust. Again, Cooper, I'm not, as much as I can, I'm not going to trust him in my fantasy championship. But in one of those daily fantasy leagues, where you can maybe get him on the cheap, I think he could give you good production. Rob, what do you think? Obviously Cooper let down a lot of fantasy owners this week, but are you expecting him to bounce back anytime soon? He's had a couple of bad games in a row now.
I'm a little hesitant on him. Last week I was right there with you. I ranked him very high. I thought he would be the guy. I ranked Foles very high as well. I thought that connection would have a heck of a day, but I think one thing we might have overlooked is the big play dependency that Cooper has. That big play, when it's there, great, but when it's not, it's not. So he's a guy you do take a gamble on, like we did in our rankings, and have him a bit higher on the hopes that he sees those big plays. But when he doesn't and you're off, you're going to be way off. So I don't think I wouldn't be as confident in that connection moving forward, especially after this game. I might be overreacting a little bit. But that big play dependency in a playoff situation should make you a little nervous.
Yeah, you don't want to be losing your fantasy playoffs because you started Riley Cooper over, somebody who's been fairly solid this year, like a Larry Fitzgerald type, who obviously another guy who had a bad week this week that we'll get to later. But, you'd much rather say that you lost your fantasy championship starting Larry Fitzgerald than a guy like Riley Cooper. Nick Foles, a guy that we just talked about a second ago, a guy that both Rob and I liked this week. I talked about him in my Mary Cheat dump. 19 or more fantasy points in every game since coming back from his concussion. A little bit tougher matchup this week against the Bears, but he's still going to be inside my top 7. What about you, Rob?
Definitely. He'll definitely be in my top 7.
Just very, very solid, very consistent. He's getting it done for you fantasy-wise one way or another. He's a guy that you have to start. He's a must-start for you. Rob, let me throw this out here real quick because we don't have our rankings up yet. Assuming Aaron Rodgers comes back this week, Nick Foles or Aaron Rodgers for you in your fantasy championship?
I'm probably going Foles because, in the championship, granted, Aaron Rodgers is Aaron Rodgers, and if I would feel more, I look at it like this: if I'm gonna lose my championship game, first it's gonna kill me. I made it that far and I lost. But would I feel better rolling out a guy that's had consistent weeks, week in, week out, or rolling out a guy who's coming off his first game back, albeit probably one of the best quarterbacks of this generation? So, for me, I would feel better rolling out the consistency in what I've seen and what I know than taking that gamble, especially in the championships.
Yeah, like we said, Foles has just been so consistent and so good. You're rolling with him. Aaron Rodgers, you have so many question marks there. Number one, is he, what happens if he re-aggravates the injury? What happens on the first hit he takes? All those. And even beyond all that, even if he makes it past that, is he going to be rusty? Is he going to come out like Jay Cutler did this weekend and throw 2 picks in the first quarter? You don't know how rusty he's going to be. Hasn't played in, I think, pretty close to a month now. It's been a while. I'm rolling with Foles over Aaron Rodgers, but, I could see some people rolling with Rodgers over just because he's Aaron Rodgers. And then Viking side, what continued obviously a wacky fantasy weekend here. Matt Asiata, the Vikings running back filling in for an injured Toby Gerhart, who was filling in for an injured Adrian Peterson. 30 carries, 51 yards, but 3 touchdowns. 3 touchdowns from a guy who will never probably see another touchdown the rest of his NFL career. Just crazy, crazy, crazy. Just goes to show you that sometimes fantasy, it's better off to be lucky than good. I often compare it to poker where, amateurs, kind of say that it takes more, amateurs, it takes, well, I should say from a pro side, there's more luck involved than a pro would like to admit, and there's more skill involved than an amateur would like to admit. It's just one of those things. I had a guy this weekend, Rob, this is a funny story on Twitter. I recommended Chris Obanaya over Matt Asiata this weekend, obviously because, Cleveland playing against the Bears, nice, easy matchup. And, of course, once Asiata starts scoring the touchdowns, he's blowing up my Twitter. Oh, my God, I can't believe you told me to start this guy, blah, 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 blah. listen, let me just say this real quick. If you're in your fantasy playoffs and you're relying on Chris Obanaya or Matt Asiata, you didn't deserve to be in the fantasy playoffs to begin with, okay? Stop blowing up my Twitter handle. You didn't deserve to be in the fantasy playoffs anyway. Let it go. All right? Let it go. Do you agree with that, Rob?
Yeah, if you had said Asiata, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be right. It's just that one time you weren't. And if that guy would have started Asiata and even listened to you, I would think he's crazy. But, you made 100% the right call. I would have made the same one.
Yeah, and like I said, if you were looking towards either one of these guys last weekend, you didn't deserve to be in the fantasy playoffs. By the way, Greg Jennings here, 11 catches, 163 yards, and a touchdown. Rob, are you buying into this, or do you think this was just another weird, wacky, crazy performance that we had this weekend?
A little bit of both. I think it was weird and wacky in the sense that the Vikings offense is not going to be that potent every week. We're not going to see 40 points out of that offense every week. So I chalk it up to a good week for the offense, and then with that said, the key players in that offense were, I'd almost say probably directly linked to the performance. So if this is a 41-point game, cut that in half, and I think you can pretty much split these guys' stats in half, each of them, and that's probably where they would be more often than not. I feel bad for those smart fantasy owners that did tie up a handcuff on Peterson with Gerhardt and then had to roll with another option. I had that in our league, and I chose Cordarrelle Patterson over Asiata. Still worked out. I mean, Patterson still had a touchdown, decent game, but obviously not 3 touchdowns on the ground. So I think Jennings is going to be the wide receiver to own, even over Patterson with what he's been doing lately. But I actually think Jennings is a decent flex next week in your fantasy championships.
Yeah, here's the thing about Greg Jennings that I don't think a lot of people are realizing. The last 3 weeks with Matt Castle at the helm, 32 targets. So he's getting a lot of looks, even going back to games like Week 4 earlier in the season when Matt Castle was the quarterback, over 90 yards and 2 touchdowns back in their Week 4 game. So whatever it is, Matt Castle likes Greg Jennings. That's the guy he's looking to. That's the guy he's throwing to. And let's be honest, the Vikings are going to be down in almost every game. They're going to be throwing the ball. Matt Castle's going to be looking to Greg Jennings. It's at this point in their careers, by far the best receiver the Vikings have. So he's going to get the work. Rob, to your point, I think he's probably a solid wide receiver too, and another guy in those daily fantasy leagues that I'm pretty much putting in every one of my lineups because he's just a great, great value right now. Seahawks and Giants. Rob, we talked about this on Friday. Tell us a little bit about your 19th ranked defense, the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, the only thing I can assume is you just thought 18 other defenses were going to score over 20 fantasy points this weekend, right?
I think as sad as it is, overestimated the Giants and how they were playing. I thought like any good stock market crash or financial crash, I thought this was that was the lowest that we had seen of the Giants. They were on the up. Manning wasn't going to break the interception record. He was looking like he might be able to stay away from that horrible record, and he still can, obviously, but this game didn't help him. So for me, I thought we had seen the worst. Another thing is I had looked at the games before Andre Brown and after Andre Brown, and I was noticing the difference that he was making in that offense. So I thought that combined with the fact that the Seahawks are a little beaten up, I thought that it might not be the Seahawks game, but this is one I'll bite the bullet. I was wrong on this one.
Yeah, I was going to say, you obviously hadn't been following what I've been saying earlier this year, which is start your fantasy defenses against the Giants, because it's just fantasy gold, especially when it's a team like Seattle. Rob, I got to ask you, I mean, the Giants side of the ball, you're probably still starting Andre Brown, but no other Giants player in your fantasy championship, right?
Yeah. Yep. I'd say that's about right.
Yeah, and then just throwing it out there in case you were still thinking about a guy like Victor Cruz. Did suffer concussion in this game. They're still currently trying to figure out whether or not to shut him down for the year, they said. It's a lost season for them. They know it is. They're not making the playoffs. It's just best that they shut him down and just kind of move on. So don't even think about a guy like Victor Cruz next weekend. And then, Rob, real quick, Seattle side, you're starting all your Seattle guys, but you're kind of worried next week against the Cardinals. Number one rush defense, that's going to give a guy like Marshawn Lynch, some troubles. Patrick Peterson is going to be on somebody. I don't want to say the Seattle number one receiver because I don't really think they have one, but obviously that's going to kind of limit Russell Wilson's numbers a little bit. Are you worried about the Seattle offense against the Cardinals this weekend?
I am. The one saving grace is that it is a home game. And Seattle, obviously plays a lot better at home. That's probably one of the biggest home field advantage stadiums in the league. Yeah. But I am nervous. That Cardinals defense is a strong defense. It'll be an interesting battle, Lynch versus that run defense, that number one run defense. But I think at the end of the day, I think talent wins out, and I would still, you got to play Lynch with confidence, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, he's still a top 10 guy. He's still going to be ranked as such, I think, by every fantasy ranker that you'll see out there. Just wouldn't be surprised if you see a 60 to 80-yard rushing day, but it's probably a 75% chance of getting a touchdown or something like that for a guy like Lynch. 49ers and Bucks, another guy I kind of highly endorsed this weekend was Colin Kaepernick. Another guy I talked about in my Mary Cheats dump this weekend. Really rose to the occasion here. 19 fantasy points. This week coming up, he gets the Falcons, who have been terrible against the pass. Is he going to be a top 7 guy for you, Rob?
I think he'll be a little lower than that. Just because I have confidence in a few other guys, maybe more so than him. But you're right; he's definitely trending in the right direction. We each had him at 9 last week, so we each had him as a top 10 play. I think I'll still keep him probably in that top 10, but I don't know about top 7.
Yeah, I think he's going to be borderline top 7 for me. I think I like him a little bit more, I think, than most. I just think it's a great matchup, and ever since Crabtree's been back, he's really just been putting it together. He has those receiving options, and he still gets points with his legs. He can still pick you up 30, 40 yards a game rushing. So, despite having games like in this one where he only passes for 200 yards, he makes up the difference with his legs, and with all those receiving options, it's really kind of hard to shut him down. Bucks side, next week you're starting all your Bucks. You're starting your Vincent Jacksons. Maybe, the Mike Lennons of the world you're not starting, but a guy that I think is kind of interesting and is kind of resurfaced, Tim Wright. 7 catches, 82 yards, and a touchdown on a team leading 9 targets. Second straight week with a touchdown. I think he's back in a tight end 1 territory. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, he's such an up and down guy. When he's up, he's definitely a tight end 1. But his lulls make me nervous. I probably will have him ranked as a tight end 1 in terms of top 12 in a standard league. But I also don't feel great about his prospects of having a big game. I think, one buck I'd probably stay away from, too, is Bobby Rainey. I think, hopefully you're not, if you're in the championships, he probably hasn't gotten you there, although, he had a big week 2 weeks ago against Buffalo. But this past week, I think, is more what you can expect out of him.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the Rams have been allowing quite a bit of rushing yards and touchdowns to running backs this year, so might be a little bit more favorable matchup. We know he gets a big workload. It sounds like I'm going to be a little bit higher on him this week than you will be, but just another guy to consider. Hopefully, like you said, you probably have better options if you have Bobby Rainey.
And his matchup is great. You can't fault someone for starting him. That Rams defense is not a strong run defense, but me personally, just seeing his talent and what he has to offer, he's more of a big play guy, and those aren't the type of guys that I like to obviously roll with in playoff matchups.
Bills and Jaguars, I thought this was kind of interesting. Fred Jackson, obviously, he's the number 15 running back in fantasy so far this year. In this game, he actually had his best rushing yard total of the season, just 80 yards, though. I thought that was interesting because, this is a guy that, we've really liked because total yardage, he's getting it done. Rushing touchdowns, he's getting it done. When you sit down and look at it, almost very similar to a guy like Rashard Mendenhall, but just, kind of putting it together with the receiving yards to kind of help boost his numbers. Just thought it was interesting that, being that fantasy relevant and not running for as many yards as you probably would have expected out of him, averaging just a little over 50 rushing yards a game this season really just kind of baffled me. I was really surprised by that. Jordan Todman here, I mean, another nice fill-in game for Maurice Jones-Drew, 153 total yards. MJD sounds like he's going to be back this week. It's a pretty soft matchup against the Titans. Are you trusting MJD in your championship, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, if he's back, I'll obviously watch the reports out of practice this week, make sure he's 100% ready to go. But yeah, if he's back, I am trusting him. The Todman thing is more interesting for next year and what the Jaguars will do moving forward with that running back situation. He did have a very nice fill-in game, and I thought he looked great. If MJD was out another week, he might be a guy you roll with in a flex spot. But I do think if MJD's back, I would feel fairly confident starting him against this Titans defense.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, it is a contract year for MJD. The Jaguars have an abysmal team, and I can't see them locking up a 28-year-old MJD long-term for big money like he's probably going to be looking for. So you could very well see him walk. So to your point, as soon as the season ends in dynasty leagues and keeper leagues, Jordan Todman might be a guy to kind of try to snag away on the cheap if you don't think the Jaguars are going to go out and draft a rookie running back this year. Finally, just in real deep leagues, Rob, I just wanted to point this out. I really like Ace Sanders. I mean, 5 straight games now of 6 or more fantasy points in standard scoring. Cecil Shorts obviously placed on injured reserve a little bit earlier today. It's a tough matchup against the Titans' pass defense, but I think he could still be a really interesting play in like a 16-team league as the guy who's already been performing very well.
Yeah, I agree. He's showing us a lot of athleticism and decent consistency. Out of a guy with that much athleticism, you'd expect some big plays on the a la Tavon Austin side, but he's showing us a good amount of consistency out of the slot. So yeah, I'd agree. In a deep team league, why not take a flyer on him and see how it goes.
And they are finding ways to get him the ball, lining him up in the backfield a little bit, a lot of end arounds and things like that. So they are finding different ways to get him the ball. So obviously a guy that they see as a weapon for the future. Chiefs and Raiders, we kind of talked about this already, but Jamaal Charles, 215 total yards, 5 touchdowns, just amazing. Real quick stat that I thought was really interesting. He has 7 receiving touchdowns this year, obviously 4 of them coming in this game, but those 7 receiving touchdowns would tie him for 15th if he was a wide receiver. That's how well he's performing. Has more receiving touchdowns on the year now than Andre Johnson, Victor Cruz, Torrey Smith, Pierre Garçon, Mike Wallace, Stevie Johnson. A lot of those bigger name receivers who were probably drafted as wide receiver 1s or wide receiver 2s. He has more receiving touchdowns than them now. Just kind of amazing. Do you think he's firmly supplanted himself as the number 1 overall pick next year?
With the current rosters, yes. But obviously, as you know, during the offseason, a lot's going to change. Teams are going to add players. Teams are going to get rid of players. Teams are going to obviously go different directions in drafts. But if we were restarting this same season 6 to 8 months from now, I would say yes, he's clearly the number 1.
Well, what do you think are going to be the challenges for him being number 1? I mean, for me, Adrian Peterson has a lot of injury concerns, obviously, these last couple of years. He would be a guy maybe that would be up for that number 1 consideration. LaShawn McCoy, I guess. But, we've seen that Eagles defense kind of, be real hit or miss. Who do you think would be another guy to kind of challenge him for that number 1 spot?
I think it's those 2 guys. And really, I don't even think McCoy's in the picture. I more consider Peterson and Charles to be that clear 1 and 2. Peterson, the injuries are a problem, but Charles, he's not a picture of health either, especially after last year, and all the work that he's gotten this year is, they might want to taper that back a little bit if they're going to have him long term, which obviously is the goal. So yeah, I guess right now, if you're asking me today, I'd say yes. Maybe let's say Minnesota gets a quarterback that can make a difference, that proves that he can make a difference. Maybe even a running quarterback that can, keep the linebackers a little more honest for Peterson. It's those types of moves that I think might put Peterson ahead. But today, you're right. It's definitely Charles.
Yeah, that is interesting. I didn't think about that. Obviously, the drafting of the quarterback for the Vikings. There are rumors out there right now that it sounds like Leslie Frazier and Christian Ponder are going to be out after this year. So that should be interesting to see how those changes will impact the Vikings. Nobody else for the Chiefs, though, that you're probably starting in your championship game, except for maybe Alex Smith. But there's no Chiefs you're starting, right, Rob?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, last week I thought Bo was an interesting play, but he assured us that, no, he's still the Dwayne Bowe from earlier this year. So, yeah, I agree with you.
He's still the pot-smoking Dwayne Bowe. Not expecting a whole lot out of him. Jets and Panthers, another game with very little fantasy relevance here for your fantasy championship week. Jets side, you're not touching any of these guys in your championship. And obviously, if you had any real Jets player, you probably weren't making it to your fantasy championship this year. Panthers side, obviously, Cam Newton, still a must-start. Obviously, against the Saints secondary, he's definitely going to be a top 10 quarterback this week. And then as good as D'Angelo Williams was this weekend, don't think you can trust him against that Saints run defense that's been shutting down, those top running backs that we talked about on Friday. Aside from obviously Zach Stacy, who we'll talk about later, who had a pretty good game, but not starting D'Angelo Williams there. Greg Olsen, obviously, he would be a solid start, solid tight end one. But other than Cam and Greg Olsen, nobody from either the Jets side or Panthers that you're starting, right, Rob?
Yeah, definitely agree.
Yeah, not a lot going on in that game for you guys. Packers and Cowboys, did you lose your week despite a fantasy, despite the 153 yards and a touchdown from Dez Bryant? Do you want to cry about it? You see what I'm doing there? I'm gonna go home and cry about it. Dez obviously still a real nice day there. I hate all the controversy that surrounds Dez Bryant. It seems like everything he does is just under so much scrutiny. He gets mad on the sidelines. He's a bad teammate. He goes to the locker room early. He's a bad teammate. Then you find out the backstory about it. But already by then, so many people have developed in their minds what the media is kind of feeding them. I still think Dez Bryant's a great guy. Obviously, a great fantasy player, great football player. You're starting him next weekend, but I really just wish the media would kind of stay off him and all of his things. But DeMarco Murray, double-digit fantasy points in 5 straight games now. Faces the Redskins this week, who have allowed the second most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Easy top 10 guy this week, right, Rob?
Yeah, I definitely think so. The talent's there. What's interesting to me, and I think everybody might have been wondering if they were watching the game this past weekend, was why they abandoned the run so often.
They always abandon the run. I don't know why, but they always do that second half. Every game, the Cowboys, they don't know how to call plays. That's all it is.
It's almost like Murray. I don't know if Murray's tired or what, but he looks just as frustrated as everybody else. So, I think he's a top 10 this week, but I'd like to see him commit to the run a bit more.
I would love to see. I think next year DeMarco Murray could be severely undervalued if they get either a new offensive coordinator or a new head coach possibly, or both. Because I think if they got somebody in there that could utilize him correctly, he would be a perennial top 10 running back. So I think he's a guy next year that, because of what he's done this year, will probably be in the late second, early third round, somewhere in there, kind of like he was going into this year, but somebody that could perform as a first-round pick with the right workload, basically. And as long, obviously, from what we've seen in previous years, if he can stay healthy, because that's obviously another big concern with DeMarco Murray. I think for the Cowboys, you basically got what you expected in terms of fantasy output in this game. Nice games from Romo, Dez, Witten, Murray. not great, not super, super great, not win your week great, but not terrible weeks either. Just like I said, kind of what you expected out of them. Packers side, didn't seem like obviously that gimpy ankle slowed down Eddie Lacy. 171 total yards and a touchdown. He's a stud. He's going to be a first-round pick next year. That's guaranteed. Other than Jordy Nelson, I don't think you're starting any other Packers receiver this week, unless, like we mentioned, if Aaron Rodgers comes back. But let's say Aaron Rodgers does come back. Rob, are you going to be starting or putting in your top 20 receivers any of the other receivers for the Packers?
Probably not. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, my view on Rodgers sort of mirrors my view on those receivers if he comes back. It's too much of a question mark. But obviously, and you know what? And Flynn actually, he shows flashes. I mean, he's obviously not the answer. He's more the plug-in guy. But he shows flashes of he knows what he's doing out there. So, not being able to trust Rodgers is probably going to hurt those guys for me. I might actually... And I know this sounds crazy, but I feel more comfortable ranking those guys this week with Flynn, and might even rank them higher than with Rodgers, knowing what I know and knowing what I've seen out of Flynn, and what I haven't seen out of Rodgers. I'm definitely no way stating that Matt Flynn is a better quarterback than Rodgers. It's more of just the certainty versus the uncertainty for me.
Wow, that's saying something. I mean, I think a lot of what we saw from Matt Flynn in this game was just a terrible, terrible Cowboys defense, which has been lit up by team after team. So I'm not really buying into the whole Matt Flynn thing. Aaron Rodgers, I think, is an upgrade, obviously, for me and all those receivers. The uncertainty there makes you kind of dip Rodgers down a little bit, but I think if he's in there, it bumps up, the James Joneses and the maybe Jarrett Boykin takes a step back. Because he seemed to have a decent connection with those backup quarterbacks this year. But, I think it steps up guys like James Jones a little bit, and obviously Jordy Nelson, who was already in your starting lineup anyway. Cardinals and Titans, why does Bruce Arians hate Andre Ellington? Rob, maybe you can explain this to me. I mean, 150 total yards for Ellington here, obviously much more explosive, more rushing yards on less carries again. But still, the 2 touchdowns go to Mendenhall here. I'm not an Ellington owner in any league, but if I was, I would be so frustrated. I just do not understand the usage there. Why does Bruce Arians hate Andre Ellington, Rob?
I think it's the exact opposite. Maybe he loves him so much he doesn't want to put him out there too much. He said earlier in the year that he had concerns about Ellington being an every down back. He said he's not built for that. That's not his role. And that's one of the reasons that I traded him after his big game when Mendenhall was out halfway through the year, because I don't think it's not the talent. The talent's obviously there. He's very productive. It's more the opportunity. So why he hates him, I'm not sure why he's not giving him more work. But long term, he's probably doing the right thing. I mean, this Cardinals team, I think, is overperforming. And, as long as they're winning, he has no real reason to necessarily overuse Ellington, as opposed to maybe giving Mendenhall a little bit more of the dirty work, which happens to be around the goal line, being that Mendenhall's not the long-term solution.
I didn't think of that. Maybe you're right. To your point, he does like Andre Ellington, and he's just worried that Ellington is, comprised of fine china and Fabergé eggs, and he's worried about him getting busted up a little bit, getting a little chip in his dish, if you will.
Yeah.
But Larry Fitzgerald here for the Cardinals. Matt kind of convinced me last week. How well he's been performing, kind of opened my eyes to it a little bit, and I, just like so many more fantasy owners, got burned by him this weekend. 6 catches for 49 yards. I think I'm still sticking with him this weekend. I'm still going to obviously have him probably he'll definitely be a top 20 play, maybe even a top 15 play. I think he bounces back this upcoming week, especially as he's been playing lately. I think this was just, a down game for him and a tough matchup against this Titans secondary. What are your thoughts, Rob? Is he going to break? He'll obviously break your top 20, I'm assuming. Will he break your top 15?
I think 15 is right about where I'll have him. I'm assuming that he's going to be fine. he passed the early concussion tests, and as long as that goes according to plan, according to the Cardinals, he'll be out there this week, and he'll be around my 15. He's the guy, and I still like him. And if I've been riding him to this point, and I was fortunate enough to get through last week, I think I'm going with him again in hopes of a big game. But I'm not. He's a guy that I'm probably lower on than most, so I'm not feeling confident about it.
All right. Chris Johnson, here's the thing with CJ No Way. He seems to do the opposite of however I feel about him every week. If I absolutely hate him last week like I did, obviously last week ranked him as my 27th running back, he has good games like this, 91 total yards and a touchdown. And then the games where I love him, stick him in my starting lineup, he does terrible. So I'm going to go on the record this week and say I'm going to hate him again this week. So everybody feel free to stick him in your starting lineups and win your fantasy championships, because Chris Johnson's going to have a good day because I hate him again. That's just kind of how Chris Johnson and I work. I just wanted to point out real quick, he just needs to average 106 total yards in these final 2 games to reach 1,400 total yards for the 6th straight season. Every season he's been in the NFL, 1,400 total yards. That's not something to laugh at. I mean, that's a considerable amount of yards. If he could ever put together a season with some touchdowns, we'd be talking Jamal Charles type productivity. He has that kind of explosiveness, or at least did. He's involved in the passing and running game. I just really wish he could put it all together for a full season, kind of like he did in that 2,000-yard rushing season. Rob, where do you think you'll rank Chris Johnson this week?
I'm going to be high on him. I like the matchup, and like you mentioned, his usage in the passing game is something to take note of. One thing just I'm sort of noticing this year, hate to step back and take a look at big picture, but I'm starting to believe, and you've mentioned this in the past, Marcus, many times, I'm starting to believe that the only running back to really feel confident about is the one that is involved in the passing game and can get you those total yards. We're seeing it more and more this year. Running backs getting more involved in the passing game. We're moving to a more passing league. Alfred Morris, who burned some people this past weekend, he's not that guy in the passing game, but Johnson can have 40 yards rushing and still have a productive day for you. So more than ever, especially this past week, maybe it's just, maybe I got Charles and Johnson and Chris Johnson on the mind, but it's just, the passing running backs are able to sort of get you through those rough running weeks. So I'll have Johnson pretty high this week, especially because of the matchup.
Saints and Rams, Drew Brees has one of his worst games of the year, 393 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Honestly, I hope he has an equally bad Week 16 because somehow, even with that bad fantasy performance, I play him in 3 out of my 4 fantasy championships that I'm in. I really hope he has another week like that again because I could really use it. Marcus Colston, though, Rob, is he back? I mean, back-to-back weeks with a touchdown now, 8 or more receptions in both of those games, and 13 targets in each. It seems like the workload's back, and it seems like that's making Marcus Colston back.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think part of his rising is sort of Jimmy Graham's dropping. Graham's not getting those double-digit catches the past few weeks, but I think Colston's filling that void nicely, and I liked him this week. I had him ranked very high. I recommended to a few people to start him, and it worked out, and I think it will this upcoming week as well.
Yeah. And then Rams side, Zach Stacy, you're starting him. That's it. Moving on from the Rams. Bengals and Steelers, Le'Veon Bell, he is so lucky he is involved in the passing game because I continue to hate his yards per carry. 24 carries, 57 rushing yards, and a touchdown, 5 for 50 receiving. Where do you think he's going to be drafted next year, Rob?
I'd probably say he's probably a second-round pick. For me, I think the success in the passing game is a testament to his talent, and the lack of success in the running game in terms of yards per carry is more a testament to the horrible offensive line. If he's in space, he can make guys miss. He's not extremely elusive. He doesn't have top speed, but he has enough to break that first tackle and get that yards after catch. If he can get a competent offensive line that can get him in space every now and then, I think he can mirror his passing production in the running game. So for me, I like his skills. I like him as a player. And the fact that he's the guy and he'll continue to be the guy in Pittsburgh is worthy enough of at least a third-round pick.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think second round I think someone will jump on board with him on the second round. It won't be me because we all know about how much I hate Le'Veon Bell. But, Rob, let me ask you this, because I think this is another guy that will probably go end of the second, early third next year. Who would you rather have, Le'Veon Bell or Reggie Bush next season?
Probably, I'm going to say Le'Veon Bell. Because, one, I don't like Bush being injury-prone. Two, I think, maybe it's because I watched the game last night, but he looks a little soft to me for a guy that's going to make an impact in terms of usage and amount of carries. So I trust Bell's health a little more, and I think Bell is obviously your more consistent back, which after this year with the ups and downs that I've had of some players on my team, I'm definitely going to lean more towards consistency, I think, next year.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right. Le'Veon Bell's going to get much more work. Reggie Bush, to another extent, another Bell. Joique Bell obviously seems to be carving out a little bit bigger role in the Lions game. My thoughts are they're doing that to obviously preserve Reggie Bush a little bit, but that's obviously another concern you'll have with Reggie Bush next year that'll make him kind of slide down a little bit in fantasy drafts. Antonio Brown, all this guy does is score touchdowns, it seems, over the last few weeks. I finally got on board the Antonio Brown train. It just unfortunately took me 15 weeks to get my ticket to get on board, but I'm finally there with you guys. He's a wide receiver one. He's a must start, obviously, in your championship. AJ Green, another decent game here. 9 catches, 93 yards. But honestly, I might have expected a little bit more out of a guy like AJ Green when he gets 18 targets. I mean, 18 targets is a ton. 9 for 93, you're not complaining, but you kind of are. I mean, as weird as that sounds, just expected a little bit more. He's going to be fine, obviously, moving forward. But a guy that I think could be real interesting next week, especially in, real deep leagues, Marvin Jones. 9 touchdowns this year. We all know about his 4-touchdown game earlier this season, but a touchdown now in each of the last 2 games. And this upcoming week, they get the Minnesota Vikings, who we all know, everybody can score on the Vikings. Rob and I can both score on the Vikings, and we can score on the Vikings sitting at home on our couch. That's how bad they are. I think you could do much worse than a guy like Marvin Jones if you're in a 16-team league, or like we've been talking about those daily fantasy leagues where you can probably get him really low and on the cheap. Anything you want to add about the Bengals, Rob?
For me, I mean, obviously this is a dream matchup in that passing game. For me, I was a Rodgers owner, relying on Dalton this past week, but the plan was always to have him for this final week. If you are desperate as I was with my quarterbacks were Rodgers, Dalton, and I rolled with Keenum for a bit of the year, but I think you can feel fairly confident with Dalton if you were in a situation similar to me where you need a guy. The rest you obviously focused on the rest of your team all year, and you need a guy. I think he'll have one of his bigger games, which as he's shown this year can be very relevant and can almost win you some weeks.
Yeah, I'm expecting a big week for Andy Dalton as well. Obviously hard to trust him. Hopefully you're not reliant on Andy Dalton in your fantasy championship, but a guy that I think would cause a little bit of hesitation if you had, the Colin Kaepernicks or that type of thing, if you're still rolling with those guys. Ravens and Lions. Rob, I don't know if you saw it, but Justin Tucker giving a shout-out to his fantasy owners last night after kicking his 6 field goals, including that 61-yard at the end of the game. This dude gets it. I mean, he understands that the only reason you'd be watching the Ravens outside of Baltimore is to watch him kick 6 field goals. I mean, he understands fantasy. He gets it. Thank God, because, no one cares about the Ravens. They really don't. Torrey Smith, 4 for 69 on 12 targets. Aside from Tucker, he's the only Ravens player that you're playing in your championship game. Not a whole lot to talk about on the Ravens side. Maybe Dennis Pitta, little disappointing of a game, but Pitta still seems to be a tight end one. What do you think?
Yeah, I guess you could.
Right on that edge, like number 12, 11-ish, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I definitely think next year he is. I still think he's sort of getting his legs under him, but yeah, I'd put him about there right now with you.
Lions side here, Matthew Stafford now back-to-back games with 7 or less fantasy points. I own Stafford in one league, and I still managed to make my fantasy championship. Thank you, Jamal Charles, for that. I appreciate it. Next week against the Giants, do you trust him? I mean, personally, I don't, but I don't have better options either. My quarterbacks in that league are Matt Schaub, and Geno Smith. So I'm still obviously rolling with Stafford, not feeling good about it. But for some reason, I have a gut feeling he kind of gets it back going in this game. Rob, what are your thoughts on Matthew Stafford?
I'm there with you. Still hesitant, but the one thing I will say is that the Lions, more than ever, they need a good game. I think at this point in the season, I do start to look at the standings and see who's playing for something, because that obviously changes the motivation. It's a long football season. Heck, it's a long fantasy season. As you get towards the end, you get a little drained from all the fantasy stuff. Imagine the players week in, week out. So if they've still got something to play for, which obviously Stafford and the Lions do, I expect them to still come out with that same fire. So for me, yeah, you're right. Stafford, he hasn't been the Stafford of late, but I think Giants. The Giants are a decent matchup. They've obviously proven to be a little better defense than we might have thought they were earlier in the year. So for him, I don't predict. He's a guy I'm going to go middle of the road on. I'm going to cop out on him this week and say he's not going to have a great game, but he's not going to have a horrible game either.
All right. Finally, Megatron, Reggie Bush, they're healthy. They're in your starting lineup. Not a whole lot to say there. I just want to really quick bring up our Blindside Fantasy Staff League that we had going on this year. I know we haven't really mentioned it since the beginning of the year, but just wanted to give a couple shout-outs here. As you know or may not know, we did a pros versus Joes section. One division was the pros, a lot of the writers from the Blindside team, and the other section was Joes. A lot of our fantasy listeners that listen to this podcast read our articles on the website and obviously follow us on Twitter. So just wanted to give a big shout-out to Daryl Hanman. He defeated Eddie Driscoll in the Joes side. Eddie Driscoll actually went undefeated in the regular season.
Wow. Only
to be upset by Daryl in the first round of the playoffs. So, real bad time for your team not to put it together. Matt, he couldn't obviously be here tonight, but he did make it into the finals of the pros division, but lost against our writer Ty Miller. So, Ty, if you're listening, we need you to bring it home for the pros this week. We need to show our listeners that we do know something, and we haven't taught them everything we know. Let's bring it home for the pros this weekend. Finally, make sure to follow Rob and I on Twitter, me at Marcus Katkin, Rob at R. Drouin. Keep sending your questions to #BlindsidePod or emailing us at blindside@blindsidefootball.com. As we've mentioned before, Matt, Rob, and I live tweeting every Sunday from noon until kickoff, answering your start and sit questions. So make sure you keep those coming. Fantasy Championship week, so make sure you now more than ever, make sure you get those questions into us to get our opinions on them. And just like the guy with the Matt Asiata, you don't have to go with what our answers are. You don't have to like them either, but hopefully they work out for you. Rob, do you want to add anything before we go?
No, I'm going to continue to mourn this week, try and get through the weekend, and if you're in your championships, I'm envious. You guys will. I got one league. I'm actually in I'm in 3 leagues. I'm in the championships of 1. It's a 2-week championship. And then I got bounced last week in our home league, which is sort of my go-to league. So, but enough about me and my morning. If you're in your championships, good luck, and hope all your guys score touchdowns.
Yeah, good luck, everybody, and we'll talk to you guys on Friday.
See ya.
Yo. Check it, it's my time. I'm rapping about Blindside Fantasy Football Podcast in this rhyme because they got me the inside scoop on Adrian Peterson. Yeah, he's that dude on Cam Newton. Yeah, they give me the news more on Megatron Calvin Johnson if I stay tuned on all quarterbacks. RG3 happens to be the fastest QB in the league. In fact, Colin Kaepernick is rider QB for them 49ers. It ain't hard to see, some awesome people hosting Marcus Katkin and Matt Dugal. You should be joining. Skinny or fat, short or tall, anyone can tune in to Blindside Football. Have a try, dude. Listen on iTunes or blindsidefootball.com too.